Blessed are you. Please be seated. Blessed are you if you mourn. Hardly something that we relish, mourning, grieving, weeping. Blessed are you who are poor. Friends, we live in a culture that shames poverty, and I think none of us want to be poor. Blessed are you who are hungry. There's going to be a lot more hungry people. Friends, Jesus stands up and says, "Blessed to those who experience things that none of us want to experience, and woe to all the things that we strive for, wealth and reputation." Jesus preaches something that completely turns on its head the way we think or want the world to be. Happy, joyful, that is that sense of that word, blessed. Joyful are those who are hungry. So often, these texts have been used as a way of saying that those who are poor are the happy poor and hungry people are happy because at some point in time, they will be fed. They will be fed when God's reign comes. They will be fed in heaven, and we don't need to worry about feeding folks now. That is not the gospel, my friends. It is not the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it is the saints who remind us that that is not what the gospel looks like. Friends, the saints here, every single one of them, are from North America. Every single one of them practiced being a saint in this world, the world that we know and taste and experience. And not a single one of them said, "It's totally fine if people are hungry. It's totally fine if people are outside. Everybody, you just wait. You'll get your coming when Jesus comes back." That is not the message of the saints. The saints are those people who at some point and at some time in their lives decided that the most important thing that they could do was care for somebody who was hungry, somebody who was poor, somebody who didn't have a voice in their world. The saints didn't confuse God's love and God's justice. They understood that love is justice. And each and every one of the saints here committed their lives to living out God's justice in their own unique way. Fannie Lou Hamer got an education somewhere around the 6th to 8th grade. She was a sharecropper, pulled out of school so she could pick cotton. And yet, she was an active member of her church. Her father was a Baptist pastor, and boy, could she preach. For years, she recognized that the failure of Black Mississippians to vote was a problem, and the way she supported organizations is she cooked. Apparently, Fannie Lou was an excellent cook. And she could sing. She could sing gospel hymns. And that's what she did as she participated with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and as she worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center as it grew as she worked alongside people like Martin and Malcolm. And she didn't always do it spectacularly. While what we know her for, most famously, is her insistence that black Mississippians had a right to vote and should vote their delegates into the Democratic Convention, and she brought the Democratic Convention of 1963 to a halt because she insisted that all those white Democrats elected by white Democrats in Mississippi didn't actually represent the people of the state of Mississippi who were significantly black. And out of her faith and the recognition that people needed an opportunity to influence the world they lived in, she went to jail, she insisted on the right to vote, she went to the Democratic Convention and eventually significantly changed the face of the Democratic Party in the South. Pauli Murray, the first African-American woman ordained to the Episcopal Church in the United States. The author, in a school paper, an assignment for her class, she was the author of the decision that ended school segregation in the United States. Thurgood Marshall was her professor and poo-pooed her paper while in class, but a decade later, when he was the head of the NAACP and called on to bring an end to education segregation in the United States, remembered her paper, and it became the law of our land. Pauli Murray, later at the end of her life, ordained an Episcopal priest, a lifelong queer woman, and today probably would have been considered trans. Maya Angelou. I read her book, Why the Caged Bird Sings, when I was in high school, and then read every other book that she wrote. Poet Laureate of the United States. A woman whose inspirational poetry has brought comfort and challenge and change to every American. Absalom Jones, the first black man ordained to the Episcopal Church after facing decades of discrimination by his church, our church, but persisted and became a priest and a leader of one of the first black Episcopal congregations in Philadelphia. The deaconess Anna Alexander, the only black woman ordained as a deaconess, which was a consecrated role, sort of a semi-monastic early way of consecrating but not ordaining women. Known as a teacher and as someone who was called on eventually by the government during the Depression to be in charge of distributing food in her area, and insisted that everybody, poor whites and poor blacks, got enough food. Trusted by everybody. Trusted enough that when she said, I don't have enough food for you this week, people understood it was because another family needed more food. They trusted her. Verna Dozier, an educator, lifelong educator in the Washington Public Schools, and eventually a participant in education curriculum in the United States, and an examiner of priests in the Episcopal Church. She has some excellent books I recommend to you. The Dream of God. Jonathan Myrick Daniels, a young man, a seminarian, who, while praying the Magnificat, that great song of Mary, where the poor are lifted up and the wealthy are brought low, felt convicted to go to the South and ride the Freedom buses, got off a bus with his friend Ruby Sales, walked into a grocery store. A man pulls up a shotgun, aims it at Ruby, and he pushes her to the side, and he is killed. Oscar Romero. I wish I had been able to find an icon of Oscar and Dolores Huerta. who lived out one of the earliest Catholic social encyclicals written by Leo, the predecessor to our current Leo. Lived out the belief that workers have dignity and that all of those who pick our food should be cared for and protected. It was a part of his faith. David Pendleton Okerhater, who remains the only indigenous American saint of the Episcopal Church, a deacon imprisoned in Florida for his suspicious activity in a Native American revolt, became a Christian and went to serve his people by caring for their needs. And then, of course, Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Some of these people were plastered all over newspapers. Everyone who knew who Martin was, some people might have known who Fanny was. Only the people in Georgia knew who Anna was. Every single one of them understood that to be the blessed poor is to be someone whom God sees and knows and loves and stands beside. That doesn't mean that they thought everyone should be poor or that everyone should be hungry, but rather, God, in God's very self, as God calls us to become more and more like Jesus, as God calls us to be saints, calls us to be people who care for the needs of others. But here's the thing, friends, none of these people did it alone. None of these people were just heroes on their own. They were a part of communities and organizations and movements and practices where together they sustained one another in the midst of persecution and suffering and violence and oppression. Friends, we are a community. And today we celebrate those saints of our nation, those saints that actually call our nation to be what our nation claims to be, and we celebrate the saints of those that have gone before us here in this place. We have had 4 deaths recently, 4 deaths in this congregation of people who were saints of God. Some of them were teachers and nurses. And every single one of them cared for this community, for people in this community, for the neighbors around us. And they did it with you. Some of you remember teaching alongside or feeding alongside. Some of you may remember that moment when that person went from just a kind of everyday person to someone that you admired because they reflected something unique and distinct about who they were in God. Some of you probably remember that their lives weren't always perfect, right? None of these people's lives were perfect. Being a saint isn't about perfection. It is about practicing as best you can and as best you know in the situation and the time you are given, the love of God for all creation. It is entering into the joy of a Jesus who says hello to the people sleeping in our breezeway. Entering into the joy of Jesus of offering what little you might have. Maybe it's one of the lunch packets that we create and you can take and put in your cars. Maybe it's writing a card to somebody else in the church and just saying, thank you for being you. Maybe it's the phone call to the person you haven't seen for a while. Hey, just checking in. How you doing? How you feeling? Maybe it's the soup that you bring to the family with a new baby. None of these people were saints by themselves. They were saints in a community. Friends, we are the community of God. We are not perfect. We do not do everything right. That's not what we're called to. What we are called to do is to learn from one another how to love, how to care, and how to become people whose lives reflect a God who wants to feed the hungry, heal the sick, clothe the naked, shelter the unhoused. We are called to do that as a community. We're not called to do everything, but the things that are distinct and unique to us. Friends, today is also the end of our time of stewardship when we ask you to commit yourself, both finances, because we need money, churches need money, but also to commit yourselves to the way in which God is calling you to be a saint in this community. And so many of you have stepped up to care for this community. We have stepped up to do bookkeeping, to pick up trash, to lock and unlock doors, to take the food that's offered sometimes at the altar and deliver it to the variety of organizations that we support, to keep that pantry out there on the street stocked, to go volunteer at another organization or another church, knowing that we may not be able to do all the work, but we can go help other people care for people. We are a community of people who, like these folks, are learning what it is to love God in this time and this place. I hope that this community is the kind of place that you want to support. I'm assuming it is because you're here. More importantly, though, I hope that this community is a place where you are transformed, where we are transformed from being a people afraid and anxious and obsessed with status and whether we have enough, to being a people who take joy in living out what it means to be the blessed people of God, caring for those who are hungry, clothing those who are naked, loving one another. As you reflect on both your financial support for this church, please also reflect on the gift that you have to offer. For some of you, it might feel like you don't have a gift to offer. I have heard so many of us who are aging wonder what possible role that we have. But I remember digging in the gardens outside and being fed some really great food by people who couldn't dig, but they could feed me as we filled those garden beds. I know that every single one of you can write a card to a neighbor. I know that we can all pray. Sometimes activism looks like Martin Luther King and Fannie Lou Hamer, and sometimes it just looks like Deaconess Anna Alexandra making sure people have food. Sometimes it looks like praying quietly for people, and sometimes it looks like standing on a picket line. I don't know what God is calling you to, and we are discerning together what we are called to. But we are called to be a community of people who gather together and are transformed so that we can be sent out as lovers of God, of creation, and of all our neighbor. Friends, blessed are you. Amen.